And being academics and trying to work on logic, they really believe that the general population today really has no function except to pay taxes and then eventually to die off, because we're all consuming what they see at the top is their future resources. They'll keep them alive, so it'll sustain them and their offspring. Remember, they truly are Darwinists at heart. And this, even though I'm saying it on this show here, and people will be saying, I don't believe that. It's nothing to do with believe it. Check it out yourself. There's lots of articles put out by professors on this very topic. Tonight at 8 p.m. I'll be reading some of them. And you'll find, yep, they really are like this, and this is what they really say. And not only say, they belong to the powerful institutions that are involved in bringing it all about, because they create public policy through what you think is your government. That's how it's really run. It's not good news. It's not good news, but you cannot fight in any kind of situation or any kind of war unless you understand what you're fighting. You can't do anything unless you know what you're fighting. Not only that, you must understand the enemy's techniques. You must also understand your own weaknesses. And you have to be honest about your own weaknesses, because your enemy will know them and he will exploit them. And our weaknesses have been used against us since the end of World War II, steadily. It's no accident that we had such an explosion of entertainment since the 40s, speeding up in the 60s till today. Even getting more and more entertainment, more TV channels, more internet stations and so on. More and more as the system has been taken apart. People are so into fantasy, they can't tell the difference between reality and fantasy anymore. Many of them can't. And when they go in and switch on their favorite TV station or comedy or whatever, and on come their familiar faces, it doesn't matter if they've just heard on the news that 10 new old factories have just closed or moved to China, or the unemployment's up by so many million or whatever. It means nothing to them as long as those same familiar faces come on. Then everything obviously must be all right. In their life, that is true. Everything in their life at that moment is still the same. And there's nothing you can watch on television. There's nothing you can enjoy in a movie or a comedy that is not completely full of political correct ideas. That's how you're upgraded all the time. You don't consciously think through any particular problem as presented through a drama format or a comedy format, and you're simply sitting back and they show you what the resolution to that is, and you will copy that resolution without ever consciously figuring it through yourself. During the 70s, the late 70s, there were years across Europe, especially in Britain, and I traveled all over the place. I come back to Britain and I couldn't believe the news. Every day it was a series of factories closing down, millions of people unemployed. There wasn't a family that didn't have members affected by unemployment. Britain overtook Sweden for the capital of the world for suicides. And there wasn't a street in Britain that somebody did not commit suicide. Lots of young people too. And older people. And yet it turned on that media, and there's the same old faces on television. People did not want to sit down and talk about the disaster that was happening all around them. They preferred to go into the world of fantasy. Why? Because they were afraid. And those that give us the fantasy know that. They understand that. They understand that. And people wouldn't talk about it because it's almost like talking about it, you bring on bad luck and maybe you would be unemployed tomorrow. The one big difference from the US and Canada that Britain did, the different technique was they didn't tell them that their factories were all being moved offshore. Here, at least they told us that it was all being moved off to China. There were bits in the newspapers, but even then most folk didn't know because they didn't read anything. Their world was always switched into, their spare time was switched into fantasy. They didn't really care what was happening. Most of them flitted through the transportation of all their factories to China, that whole period, without knowing that the GATT treaty helped set it all up. The big international conferences went on talking about how they would transfer it all, who'd pay for it all, which happened to be the taxpayers. And the US taxpayers are still paying for their factories for 10 years after they were set up in China. Or even longer, it could be extended for 20 years if the companies claim that they haven't got an adequate profit that they expected because of the move. What a deal, eh? Couldn't lose there. But most folk are oblivious because they are never in reality. They live in fantasy. And they'll talk fantasy to each other, or trivia, because just again, like I said before, if you talk about the real stuff, it's almost like bringing on bad luck on yourself. Maybe bad things will happen. The same thing happened in the Soviet Union when the different agencies would raid homes at night and grab people out their beds. And all the streets would be turned out. It turned out the streets, the locals, to witness it under the Soviet law, partly to terrify them this might happen to you. And sure enough, they'd grab a family and off they'd go. And nobody would talk about that. They were all there together the night before. No one would talk about it the next day. Our nature is so well understood. It's used as a tool to manipulate us, to keep us out of any kind of action whatsoever. It's used to control us by those who understand it. We're the most studied species on the planet, unfortunately. The Rand Corporation. Amazing too, another non-profit, non-governmental organization. This Rand operation basically ran for the government, this project during the whole Cold War, right up to the present. They're still churning out reports for governments on projections and how to manage people. And they fed everybody's data, every citizen they could get a hold of in the US and outside the US, in the Western countries, put you down as numbers and put you through computers to try to find out how predictable you are. And they were putting that through from at least the 70s right through under the form of what they called game theory. And what they'd come to believe through us as paranoid schizophrenic who came up with the idea, but who was a professor and therefore he was listened to, was that everybody was basically out for themselves. And everyone would turn everyone else in under pressure to save themselves. But with a collection of data on everyone's daily life, what they did, what their hobbies, what interests were, what they worked at, who their friends were, they could find patterns of behavior in little groups, clusters they call them. And therefore, they could be utterly predictable in their behavior. And the government, see, they like that. They like predictability. They don't like people who come up with ideas and do different things every day of the week. They might not go to this club on a Thursday, they might go somewhere else. They like the people who phone up so-and-so on Tuesday, who go to this meeting on Thursday and attend this poetry class on Friday or whatever else it happens to be. That's predictability. Those are classes safe people. They're out, they're running, they'll have no problem with them at all. That's also why when they brought out the fake guise of terrorism, they labeled the lone wolf as the person who you should be worried about. Back with more after this break. Hi folks, I'm Alan Watt and this is Cutting Through the Matrix. Just talking about how we're so predictable because we don't realize that so much data has been collected on us since really the 1950s onwards. I watched a documentary on Britain from the 1980s to do with the police powers that were being expanded at that time in Britain. And the police chief that was in charge for the Home Office for the whole of Britain was being interviewed. Very arrogant character too, with a uniform. Always be wary of guys in uniforms who are arrogant. Very arrogant. Remember, this was to be public servants. And he was asked about the data collection on the citizenry. And he was asked too, was it true that every streets in Britain, and other countries too, had people who were informers, who updated the police with everything that was happening, all to do with gossip, and that records of all this gossip was kept. And he said, well, he didn't deny it. And he actually said he wished he had a lot more of it. Well, guess what we do today?